Welcome to the Sanskaari Girls Podcast. I'm Vandita Morarka, and today we're discussing representation as more than just a celebration of diverse voices, but rather as a deeply fraught question about the structural barriers that decide whose experiences and narratives even make it to mainstream literature. I'm so honored that today we have with us Annie Zaidi, whose writing has been such an inspiration for me from the first days of studying political science to today. So, a writer who works across many, many forms fiction, essays, poetry, plays, film, and whose work deeply grapples with questions of voice, of silence, and who has authority to speak. She's the author of Prelude to a Riot, which won the Tara Literature Live Book of the Year award, Breath Cement Cactus, which won the Nine Dots Prize, and Known Turf, Banishing with Bandits and Other True Tales, a collection of reportage that P. Sainath called some of the best writing on Dalits in Punjab. She's also the editor of Unbound, 2000 Years of Indian Women's Writing, an anthology that traces women's literary voices across millennia. I can't think of having any other guest to have this conversation with. I'm so glad and so grateful you made time. Annie, welcome.
Thank you so much, Vandita. And thank you to the Sanskaari Girls Podcast. I'm very pleased to be here.
So I'm going to start off by something you said in an interview about Prelude to a Riot, that you don't spend much time thinking about form or genre, but you actually start writing something and let the work itself guide you into the form that may seem natural for its themes. That, it sounds so effortless, but I'm sure it's not because the work you produce is so formally varied, politically sharp. So how do you actually navigate this crossing over between different genres when you're approaching difficult material about caste, class, and communal violence? And also a little bit maybe about what that process of letting the work guide you looks like in practice for a lot of young writers and listeners joining in. Yeah.
So, like I said, I do let the work itself find its way forward, but it certainly is not effortless. It is often actually quite daunting and sometimes a little scary because very often, actually, what you see is the work that does manage to find its way, the work that you manage to finish and polish to the extent that you are happy with it, and then you go look for publishers, etc. A lot of times, the way I work is that I have a lot of unfinished stuff that failed in some way, stuff that I thought was okay to send out, but then you look at the reactions it's getting and you're like, nah, this isn't working. So you put it aside, you think about it, you think, should I come back to it after 2 years to take another look at it? By that time, the urgency or the impetus that was driving the work has dissipated. There's nothing there. Um, or you have evolved in your thinking. And so it might be there are things I've written, there are plays I've written that have never been either published or performed in any way. And at this point, I'm not even sure I want them to be out in any way because I'm not the person anymore who wrote those things. My thinking has changed. And I can see they're not quite working. So a lot of things require workshopping. I think this is particularly true of drama. It does benefit from having it being read out aloud. With fiction, it's even more tricky because sometimes you go on writing not knowing what form or shape. So, for example, you think you're writing a 2,000 word short story, it becomes a 20,000 word novella. Everybody hates novellas in the publishing world. They're not big enough to market properly. Nobody wants to pay uh, like 500 rupees for a really slim book. Um, and so then you put yourself in these clunky positions where thinking, should you try and publish two novellas together? Should you try and put in two novellas and two short stories to make it practical as a product, that goes into the market? All these problems are there. Um, but regardless of that, I do not believe in um, fitting the market, sort of making art in ways that the market seeks to package. It doesn't make sense to me because there's actually a lot of books out there now. If you look around you, there is a lot of what we now call content. Uh, People are constantly, the fight for people's attention is quite serious and intense. So if I am working on something, if I am writing something and wanting people's attention, it should be something that is worthwhile and urgent in some way. And that is the thing which moves me the most, that I have to do the work that is urgent for me primarily, and for my times and for my people. And so I write the way I write. But it's not easy in any way. I think one of the big things about process is that you you think you know your process, but you don't. Most writers actually don't know the process in any way. They have systems and they have rituals around how they approach their writing. They'll write for 5 hours a day, or they'll write in the morning, or they'll write in the evening. Those are rituals. That's not the process of writing itself. That process is always something which is subconscious, and it's difficult to describe. All I can say is that mine is just that I I write about the things that matter to me in the moment.
That's really powerful. Yeah, I think just I'm thinking from a listener's point of view, what's really standing out and staying for me is that you're allowed to do this your own way, you're allowed to do it slowly, and you're allowed to not know when you're approaching your work. As long as you have that intent, as long as it feels important and urgent and necessary to you in the moment. And it's such a great break to be hearing you say this, especially the part you said about monetization is a secondary thought. The first thing is the art, because it really shows up in how that art is created. Is it for consumption? Even if you call it content, right? Is it for consumption, or does it serve a deeper purpose where consumption is part of the process, but not all of it? So, really, yeah, thank you for that. It got me thinking quite a bit. I'm going to jump into one of our first questions. Prelude to a Riot was one of your first books that I read, and it's really stayed with me. And the way it's said is through multiple characters, right, from different ages, classes, religion, and they're all speaking in their own voices. So you have someone for people just encountering this book. You have like a teenage Farida, and you have an elderly Dada, and the history teacher Garuda, and a masseuse Mariam. So they're very like varied Hindu Muslim characters. Even in the known turf, you're writing about reportage about Dalit women in Punjab, about bandits, about communities. And I know that this work has been praised immensely and it's beautiful work. But you're an outsider to many of these experiences. And that must take something, right? Like to be able to imagine interior lives that are very different from your own. So what's the labor involved in that kind of research? How are you able to give voice not just to the outside experiences, but to what people sharing those identities may be experiencing on the inside?
So with Prelude to a Riot, the thing is, I didn't go looking for communal tension, and I had no intention of writing a book about communal tension. Um, I mean, if you were to ask me even now to write about it, I'd probably say that enough has been said. What is there left to say? You think that these things are overt and around you. What had happened was that I went looking for a story about labor and plantations. And because didn't go looking for it, when I did encounter it, the bigotry kind of left me feeling um, both surprising. It was surprising because that was not where I was expecting it in that moment, in that place. And not so much personally afraid, but afraid for the place, afraid for the people in it. Because these were actually people who were mostly being nice to me or were minding their own business. And when you come upon a place like that, you think, yeah, this is how it should be, right? People should be nice to you. If they can't be nice to you, they should at least mind their own business. But then you can also see these simmering tensions under the surface. And then you think about this place and you're thinking, okay, this is this place now, but what about this place next year? What's going to happen? If things are not controlled in this space, if the forces that are kind of riding high right now, if they are not stopped in some way, what will happen? If this conversation is not stopped, what will happen? This kind of talk. Um, and then my approach with that writing approach was that because I was quite distressed, I didn't know what to do with this. Um, I my research was different. My research was on farm labor, etc. So that added a layer of understanding. I ultimately never wrote that essay or whatever I wanted to write. But now I had all this material, I didn't know what to do. That okay, I know how this place works, like the economy of the place works. I know there are migrants here. I know there are tensions. I know there are jealousies. And what am I going to do with it? So I basically just started, my notes were basically verbatim, things people had said to me, and or they were talking amongst themselves and I had overheard. And then using that material, I started to just write these kind of monologues, these soliloquies, where some part of it obviously they have actually said. For example, there's this part in which it's kind of reported speech, but yeah, there is this bit where this man is saying he's a landowner and he's talking about the migrant labor and he's saying things like, oh, these tribals, they don't want to come to work and they're carrying phones now. What do they want phones for? Like what? To just they're playing all this music for whom? Is like monkeys are listening in the trees or what? This kind of conversation. And it's shocking because you're like that, come on, why does anyone want a phone? Why does anyone want to listen to music? And why do you have such a problem with them having a phone? But using that as a takeoff point, I began to slowly understand what this man is like, what the class relations here, why it matters so much for him that he should have a phone, but others should not have a phone, why it is so important that the laborers should stay poor. They cannot make money because if they make money, they will no longer come work for him. And so then with that insight, I began to think and think and think. And I used the same device then for all my characters. That one line might be something that someone has actually said, and the rest of it is my imagination.
Think that, having been in that situation and having, I feel like, stumbled upon this book that you were perhaps meant to write but didn't set out to write, it's quite easy to flatline people, right? And to be like, oh, this person's good, this person's bad. Um, and that's what a lot of representation comes down to. It becomes about visibility that, okay, look, I've added a Dalit person or a Muslim person. But there isn't complexity. And there's often also an erasure of the gray that exists in everyday life. So, how have you done that? Like, how have you done that in your work? How have you managed complexity in characters in a political context that can often be fraught with tension without showing different parts of the structural oppression as good and evil?
I think one thing I'm not interested in is representation for the sake of representation. I find that a little tiresome, to be honest, in fiction, especially. Like, even when I see movies where you have a token Muslim character or something, it always hits a false note. Like, the rest of the film is fine, but over there, there's something which I'm like, okay. In fact, there was a movie I saw I was really enjoying up to a point. Not enjoying because it was a very dark and gritty movie, but I was gripped by it and I was following it and I was empathizing with the character. Everything was fine. The thing is that there are no meaningful Muslim characters there. I mean, they're neither the heroes nor the villains, and I'm fine with that. You don't have to have that. In the middle of a random scene, you have a Muslim sounding name where somebody is just saying, okay, will you please do this? And then the name of the person is Muslim. And then I thought about that choice as a writer and as a film. Oh, why did they make that choice? They wanted to represent, they wanted to add the complexity of India to their script, right? They wanted to suggest that, okay, we can't make them the heroes, we can't make them the victims, we can't make them the villains, because with all good intentions, right? So, but we still want to represent. We don't want to represent a world in which the Muslim is completely erased. So the intentions were all good. But when they did that, for me, that was really jarring because it's almost like in some way a kind of minor object, because that person who is a reference, right, has no feelings, has no personality, has no fears, has nothing. So I find that kind of representation irritating, honestly, where you're serving the ends of others in, and not just for Muslims or anybody. It can be a different race, for example. Um, for representation to be full and meaningful, what we need is that the people who normally do not have a voice, or whose voice is being subjugated, or who is culturally kind of not represented in mainstream spaces, whether it's fiction or films or whatever, for them to be able to have a perspective and a voice. That is very important. And for the story to make sense to them also. And this can only happen when the story is about them in some way. That kind of space making doesn't happen very easily in cinema. It happens a little more easily in books and fiction, and you will see that difference. For me, I never go looking for, in fact, people have asked me this question. For example, one interviewer once asked me that, but you don't have any gay people represented in this book. And I was like, I wasn't looking to say that, okay, I have these 5 stories, so a sixth person it must be tokenistic and representative in that way. I think it makes much more sense for a gay person to be able to write their own book. That is meaningful. But for me to add one little character somewhere, or to, for the sake of adding complexity to my own work, I don't think I that's not my approach anyway. um I've also had the opposite question of what right do I have to write about people whom I do not represent in any way. That is a different discourse and a much more complex one. But the people I tend to write about are the people I tend to want to write about, and about whom I know something. So, for example, uh, if there is a person of a different class, but I'm seeing that person every day, the chances of me wanting to write about them, and also the chances of me being able to access their interiority through my own imagination is higher. Um, and that can happen both up and, and across the whole spectrum and the whole pyramid of class, right? If, for example, I'm working for a very rich person, um, and you can say that, but you're not that rich. So how do you know how a billionaire feels? No, I don't know how a billionaire feels, uh, but I'm not writing about the billionaire because I want to write about billionaires. I'm writing about the billionaire because there is something in this story that feels urgent to me, and I need to be able to tell it in this particular way. That is the way I approach it anyway. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. I'm going to maybe ask you to share a bit more about that part where you said, you've been questioned to say, what is the right you hold to write about someone you don't represent? If you feel comfortable, do you want to share a bit of what that tension and what that discourse has felt like or been like?
I think there is a general discourse, and I think that it is perhaps often even a necessary discourse. A lot of it comes from the West, I think, but I think we also do need to have that in India as well, in various structures. Wherever there is a power imbalance, what happens is that the person who is powerless in that society, or has less power in that society, does not get to tell stories. And you see this pattern repeat everywhere. Marginalized people's stories are suppressed often, and sometimes just not allowed, because that is the way society is structured, right? So, for example, in India, for thousands of years, Dalits weren't allowed to even read and write. They were not allowed to take control of the narrative. They were not allowed mainstream spaces for enacting, for example, their spaces, their poetry, whatever it is. Um, so the criticism then, whether it is, for example, people of color in white majority nations like America, etc., or for India, then it might be minorities, it might be so-called lower castes, etc., or tribes. Um, why would you write about them? Let them write about themselves. And I think there is some merit to this argument, to the extent that, yes, absolutely, people should be able to write about themselves. But I do think that there is a limit there. even to this argument. Just as there are limits to representation, there are limits to not representing people also in your work, right? When you are writing, when an upper caste person, for example, is writing about tensions in society, and they write from their point of view, which is normal, if they want to even examine their own point of view, if they want to even challenge that point of view, it is impossible to do so without bringing it into conversation with a contesting point of view, right? It is impossible to write about privilege without writing about also people who do not have privilege. So it can be peripheral, or it can be kind of where you take center stage and allow somebody with less privilege to assume that kind of voice, narrative voice. But if you're going to be honest, if you're going to really live the examined life and to write things that you have paid attention to, you cannot do that without bringing in multiple points of view and the tensions that exist in society, whether they're racial, whether they're caste, whether they're religious, whatever it is. So to me, it's really important to also be able to write with freedom of everyone. At the same time, one has to be mindful not to assume that you know what another person's life is like until you have seen and experienced it. If you're going to ask me, for example, as a journalist, I have written about multiple topics, including, for example, things like manual scavenging, right? Um, I have met people who do the work. I have interviewed them. I have been to their homes. Even so, when I write fiction, I would really hesitate because I have not done the work and I do not know what it does to a person's soul. I think I can try. That's what empathy is about. That's what writing is about, trying to access a person's interiority, etc. I could try, but the question is, should I try? I think I would have to do a lot more work of researching, of meeting people, of getting to know them, of perhaps learning to do the work myself until I earn the right to be able to tell that story, I feel. Um, but that is me, and that is me in this moment. I would still not say that the same rules should apply to everyone. I think sometimes the framing is important. With Bread Cement Cactus, for example, I knew from the start that I don't want to write a deeply personal memoir. It is a memoir. At the same time, it was also important to frame it as a memoir because finally it is about me and uh, also life as I know it. Whether I liked it or not, I was forced to acknowledge that, okay, there are these other lives around me and I know nothing about them. And as an adult, as a thinking person, you have to then think about, why do I know nothing about these lives? So I think I did have a right and even a responsibility to write about that. But I could only write from my point of view. Um, I think when you're writing in this vein, which is why I framed it also as a memoir and not as a set of political essays, for example, because ultimately, it's a very personal book. I think if I was writing a completely journalistic piece, which I've also done, so if I was writing a report, for example, I would probably take myself out completely from the equation. Those are journalistic expectations. And in fact, the personal is not allowed to enter, right? You're supposed to be objective in that space, which is also, 100% it's not possible, right? We come to a story, whether fiction or nonfiction, from our lived experience, our identity. It is impossible that your identity does not impact the way you see a story. But when it is framed as an objective report, it also becomes your responsibility to at least address the fact, to look within and saying that I'm writing it in this way, I'm seeing it in this way. Is it because of who I am? The people you seek out to interview, for example, the people who most easily talk to you, and the people who won't talk to you. All these have an impact on the kind of discourse that is built around you. So you have to at least acknowledge it, which is why in reportage we are taught to say things like, we reached out to so and so, but they would not respond to a comment, because that is important. It's an important part of the story. Um, yeah, I think that we negotiate. There is no 100% hardline answer that will um, uh, there's no rule book by which you can play, whether in fiction or non-fiction. But general guidance, I think, is a good thing is to look at what you are and what you are writing.
You're already touching upon, I think, some of the aspects of being a journalist and how that influences perhaps how you think about the written word. A lot of our listeners are readers, and I feel like as a result of that, they are writers. In some form or the other, I think they write, they explore the written word. They'd really like to, I think it'd be really useful for listeners to understand, since you've done that, I think switching around, right? You've trained as a journalist and it shapes so much of your writing. But then fiction and journalism don't carry the same obligations, they don't carry the same worldview. It'd be interesting to know that when you moved and when you started writing perhaps fiction, what was like some feedback, anything that's really stayed with you, maybe from an editor, that made you more aware of the differences between the formats.
I think very early in my reportage, I learned. I had gone out and got what I thought was this little scoop. Uh, I was this very cub reporter, first job. Um, I knew so little. Um, I was covering the city courts, and not the big courts, not the high court, the other smaller courts, the metropolitan magistrate courts, etc. And my job was to try and find stories. Because at that time I was working with Midday, um, it's an afternoon paper. It comes out later than the morningers, but if you look at it another way, it also comes out earlier than the morningers. So, for example, people would probably have subscribed to some morning paper and would have read it at 6 or 7 in the morning, whatever it is. They pick up our paper, used to pick up back in the day when people still picked up tabloids, etc. You would pick it up at the stand at 8 or 9 or 10, or maybe even at 12 o'clock in the afternoon. They don't want to see what they've already seen. If they've already watched TV last night or early in the morning, they don't want to see what everybody else has. They pick up a tabloid for what others don't give you, right? So it was our job to get things before others get them. You couldn't just publish a press report. So I would go every day to the courts, talk to the clerks, say, do you have something you haven't yet released? Do you have something coming up that I can write about? And every evening you had to have something. I had cultivated a bit of an acquaintance with this lawyer, woman lawyer, which for me was both, it it still is quite rare, to see a successful woman lawyer. She was very well spoken, etc., etc. At some point, she started giving me a lot of time. And she said, why don't you come over home? I have this really big story, but I don't want to talk about it in court. She gave me this full details, and I was like, wow, okay. Big industrial houses being targeted. Oh, okay. I came back to office. I wrote up my piece. My chief reporter, Lajvanti D'Souza at the time, she called me and said, you realize this is a hatchet job. She's feeding you information. And I was like, what do you mean? Because how then does a 21-year-old know the difference between a hatchet job with somebody who's feeding you information versus information you are extracting from them? There's no way to know the difference that young. But basically, I went to her looking for information and she gave me a story. And I thought, well, this is journalism. But my chief reporter, she taught me a very important lesson. She said, no, this is not journalism. Have you talked to the other party? And I was like, yeah, but there's no time. I need to file the report now. She said, no. Otherwise, you're basically just writing exactly what the lawyer wants you to write. And she wants you to write it because it will help her case. And, you know, build pressure on the judge to rule a certain way. So you're not supposed to do that. This lesson was very important to me. This is why we go out looking to talk to 50 people, not 5 people, you know? This is why it's doubly dangerous then to not have time and not have a budget. This is how one sided narratives are constructed. And yeah, and it is okay to take your time and drop a couple of stories rather than give someone else unfair power through the power of the media. So this I learned early. And um, and it's a big difference because fiction can be one sided, no? I can tell the whole story of the whole world, if you like, from one point of view. And writers have done it, you know. They try to tell story of the country through the point of a mouse or an object. And we do these things as exercises. But that's not journalism.
And I must say that's such a powerful example. Because I can imagine being that 21-year-old. I'm a lawyer, by the way. I'm trained as a lawyer. Before I decided to quit litigation. Yeah, I can really see that playing out for a lot of like for young Vandita and for like other young people. And it's so great to have someone who's able to step in and provide that direction and remind you what journalism means. And I know this is not the point of today's episode, but I will pick up that tangent of you can't do this work without money. To do solid journalism, you need time and investment and people who can give you that direction and guidance. Yeah. Do you want to share a bit more about that before we move ahead?
I took a conscious decision fairly early that I wanted to work in different capacities. I didn't want to be only on the desk. I wanted to be out and reporting and writing. And I did that for a few years. At some point, there was this boom in broadcast, and all my friends and classmates was going to television. I was not really tempted, partly because I saw myself mainly as a writer rather than, you know, um, an anchor or something, but also because I think there is something in the nature of television journalism that is not given to nuance very much. Um, it is mostly kind of debates, and these are kind of structured debates. It's not like you actually get to say anything meaningful in 2.5 minutes. You have to really fight to be able to get even those 2.5 minutes, and you're lucky if that happens. Um, or you will have the kind of reporting where a lot of my friends did very good work, and TV can be powerful. But what happens is that a lot of times, like you might get to do, say, one good documentary in the year, and the rest of the year is shoving mics in people's faces. And I didn't see myself doing that. Um, Firstly, I'm just as a person, I'm not very good at just randomly approaching people and saying, tell me this, tell me this, tell me this, you know. But a lot of TV journalists have to do that. And I'm not judging them doing it. It's just that I couldn't do it. I don't think physically I was capable of it. Uh, um, the other thing is that if you want to write and be a journalist, you have to have money. I went freelance at some point because I wanted to also write books and longer works, etc. And I found that it was a very serious challenge being able to do proper reportage on your own. What happens is that unless somebody commissions a story, and that is very, very, very rare in India, where somebody will commission a news or kind of reportage as such. What happened was that I often got commissions from cultural magazines or from travel magazines. It's not like I went looking for what we call features articles rather than hardcore news reports. I would have liked to do both. But the only commissions that came were from cultural places where they'd say, okay, we're looking at this trend. Why don't you go look at it? But nobody would say, okay, we're looking at this demolition of this basti. Why don't you go look at that? That would almost never happen. And the thing is that they're supposed to have reporters on the job to do that. Mainstream media is supposed to have people to do that. But with budgets getting tighter and tighter, effectively you have nobody doing that. I mean, Sainath talks a lot about this, about how almost nobody has any, none of the major papers seem to have a rural beat anymore, or an industry beat anymore, or a labor beat anymore. Industry means you write about who's setting up the factories. Industry never means who's getting the jobs or who's getting thrown out of jobs. So a lot of this is about time and money. And you have to be aware of the forces that work in this way. If you want to do serious work, if you want to do meaningful work, you have to be aware of that there's almost no one who's willing to pay the bills. So how are you going to do it? You probably have to find yourself collectives and plug yourself into the collectives. You have to maybe join alternative magazines. I don't know what you have to do, but it's actually quite hard.
Thank you. Thanks for indulging my tangent. This is something that I deeply care about, and just maybe a plug to anyone listening in to go fund independent media, and to get a subscription or make a donation. But what you're sharing is something that's resonated actually across a lot of our guests, which is just around monetizing, funding, um, supporting those that do this work, especially even from a journalistic, investigative lens. So thanks for bringing that in and just going off tangent with me. You've also edited Unbound, which is 2000 years of Indian women's writing. And to me, at least, that anthology itself feels like an intervention, right? It talks about, like, look, women have been writing for so many years, even when history has not only tried to erase them, but has tried to stop them from writing. So when you did that, what did you discover about historical patterns of exclusion, also perhaps like historical patterns of conspiration, conspiring between women to make sure that we keep writing and we keep having a voice that carries on across generations? And what do you see as something that's changed over the years?
Change has most definitely come. I mean, we are at this point uh, where, it, to a certain point, I won't say across all classes, but even in India, even in other parts of South Asia, I would say, um, women, almost the same number of girls are going to school. After school, this changes. Um, and at various difficult points, the pattern changes. So, for example, if there's a drought, people will pull girls out of school first. If there are other circumstances, during COVID, we saw girls were getting married faster, things like that. Um, but education wise, literacy wise, I think we are approaching a certain kind of equality that is not translating into equality. But literacy is the basic. Without, you may or may not have equality even after literacy, but without literacy, you absolutely cannot have equality. So that part, at least, okay, that to that extent we have changed, and it must be acknowledged that we've had to fight a lot to get here. Beyond this, I think it has changed to the extent that women have moved a lot into careers, maybe because of the nature of those careers, because reading and writing are things you can do from indoors. There are things you can do in relatively safe spaces. You can, perhaps there is less resistance to women working in fields that have to do with reading and writing. So because of that, you do have more women working in publishing. You have women working in magazines and things like that, which has given them a voice. It hasn't equalized anything. In fact, I was just reading the other day about where somebody was talking about how there are so many women in publishing in India. In fact, so many that sometimes people begin to feel that they outnumber men in publishing roles. But if you look closely, you'll see that they're not there so much at the top. The CEOs, the decision making, the questions about who's making money, etc. There, it's not like women have taken over. But I will say that there is much more fair representation now than there was even 10 years ago. So that definitely has changed. Um, I think with regards to the book, because I wanted to give it that sweep, that it's not just mm, a collection of women's writing. It has to be meaningful in its own way, that, that it is about giving Indian women their own history in a sense, and also allowing them to see the diversity of things that women write about. We don't write only about the domestic sphere or the interior world. We also do write about other things around us and the struggles and battles around us. So that was important to me. I think in today's times, to the extent that if I look at the book, many, many, many more women are writing, and they're writing about all kinds of things. So obviously, it is impossible to represent everyone in one book, etc. But I do feel that in the course of doing the book, one thing I learned was that nothing has come easy. Almost nothing has come without a fight of some kind. Like the book begins with the nuns, the stories of the nuns, the Buddhist nuns. Um, Now, who are these Buddhist nuns? These are the theories who, like the monks who followed the Buddha, left their home. And for women to do that, can you imagine? Initially, even the Buddha didn't want them. Nobody wanted the women. You want the world to change, you don't want women to change. Let them do what they're doing. The rest of us will go off and do our own thing. So, uh, he did allow later, but so the women were determined to do something to change their own circumstances. Maybe they can't change the world, but the bare minimum they could do is change themselves and their lives. So lots of women gave up. They gave up domesticity, they gave up their children, they gave up their jewelry, their clothes, their everything. And they decided to become wandering, like the monks were. Wandering nuns. They begged for their food, they did their meditation, etc. How do we even know they existed? We only knew it because they wrote about it. They would have been utterly and completely erased because the monks do not write about the nuns and about what a struggle it was and what it meant to have a life in the world and then to give it up. It is only women themselves who were writing it, right? How do we know how Brahmin widows were being treated? Some men wrote, yeah, but what did it feel like to be hungry, to be not allowed to go out, to have to fight your own parents, to say that I want to get married, Uh, all these things we know because women wrote. And uh, I think that that is really the unique thing and the precious thing about these documents. I mean, even if you write one letter, it can give you a clue into history and what life was like and what the structure of power in society was like. Writing is very powerful.
It really, really is. It's such a powerful way to pass on history and to ensure that you're remembered. It's really an act of like memory making and passing that on for generations. I didn't know this about the Buddhist nuns. It never even struck me, and which is so sad that there could have been women that would leave, right, and that would go alongside. And that's such an erasure, not just from like religious or semi-religious texts, but it feels like a part of my history as a woman just does not exist. So I think every time someone even writes a tweet that shares their experience as a woman, I feel like that furthers the discourse on what we know about our inner lives and that our lives, inner and outer lives, are just as important. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you for this. Thanks for reminding and like centering us in that. Given that we've been speaking about tokenism, representation, and just sometimes the performance of diversity, I know that publishing seems to have gotten much better at talking about diversity from panels to awards, but you've been in the industry for about 2 decades. I'd really like to understand, and I think it'd be very useful for people to understand if there's real structural change that has accompanied some of the visual optic changes of the publishing industry.
To be very honest, Vandita, I'm not really in the industry, so to speak. I interact with the industry as a writer. So I have been published a lot by various publishers, but I don't know if I can uh, comment on the composition of the various things. I do know that there are many new and interesting initiatives, and these are necessary interventions. So, for example, even before my time, I mean, Kali for Women came up first, and that was, I think, one of the first that um, initiatives that made a conscious intervention in favor of women, for example. Before that, also, I think, or alongside, I'm not sure about the timeline here, but Dalit Panthers were starting to also um, take a conscious interest. And even before that, actually, right from the start, if you look at what the Phules were doing, the Satya Shodhak Samaj was doing, they were writing. They weren't just teaching and opening schools, they were publishing. And Dr. Ambedkar, he was writing. So I think these publishing initiatives from the start have to be, and in fact, if you look at it, I read a Hindi translation recently of one of Dr. Ambedkar's books. This was this lecture he was supposed to deliver. And there was this, so a group had invited him in Undivided India at the time, and they invited him to come and speak, and mm, they kept inviting him and kept delaying the invitation, saying, "Yeah, yeah, we're doing it. Yeah, yeah, we're going to print this. Oh, we've already ordered 1,000 copies. Oh, there'll be 2,000 copies in the market." But they kept asking him to first send the text of the lecture, and he was writing about caste. And when he did send it, ultimately they said, yeah, but you know, this, that, we are not sure if this is the right time to, etc., etc., etc. And he includes that in not just the core text that he's writing about when he talks about caste, he's also talking about how, even in spaces that seem to be your allies, often actually there is subtle censorship at play, where they will first say, oh, but let us at least look at it. And then they will be like, oh, there are other circumstances. They'll never directly say that, sorry, this frightens us. Um, so it has been ongoing for a long time, right? And there's no denying that in India, caste comes into play in everything. Um, Now, I think, for example, now there are not a lot, but a few definitely initiatives, and these are conscious interventions. Sometimes there might be a particularly kind of, you can say, almost activist publisher who will go about it. I think Urvashi Butalia and Ritu Menon were those people. And even though Kali for Women split separately, they've continued the work. Zuban particularly has made a conscious intervention on multiple fronts, directly looking at the margins to say, where are the margins? Even within women, there are, so for example, lots of women are now getting published. So they have shifted focus. What kinds of women are not getting published? So they look at particularly the border states. Women from the Northeast are still very marginalized in mainland India, um, Kashmir, caste-based writing. They have been publishing a lot more of that. And I think that is truly spectacular of them, because once they start doing it, the others also sit up and say that, oh, even if it's from a purely commercial point of view, they're looking at saying, oh, this is new. Nobody else has done it. So let us publish this also. Um, and I think that has made a difference. I'm pretty sure that we've not gone anywhere so far as we need to, particularly on caste, like the Bahujan, the Dalit, within Muslims also. I think now there is a lot of critique building up, even though there is no official caste in sort of, and there is a lot of denial of the way in which caste has infiltrated um, uh, Islam, the way it is published in the way it is practiced, sorry, not published, the way it is practiced in the subcontinent. And I think one needs to start writing about it. I know some scholars are researching this, and maybe they will write their own books going forward. I know Nusrat Jaffrey wrote this wonderful book about her family history and her memoir uh, about how conversions happen and who converts and why, and the complex reasoning behind it and things like that. So all of these various books have been published recently. There is perhaps a little more space than before, but I think we can go further. There is also a backlash where there is a certain kind of discourse building up now to say that, this is all, um, that there's too much of it, that, just like they do for feminism, that we've gone too far, etc., etc. There is very quickly the backlash comes. Mm, but one tries. I mean, if one is actually committed to looking at one's country in an honest way and trying to fix its problems, then I think publishing is actually at the heart of it. It always has been. So I'm hoping that we will push even further.
Yeah, after hearing you, I'm hoping so as well. And thank you for also instilling some of that hope because, at least for me, sometimes I'm like, nothing's moving. And we've interviewed Zuban actually for one of the episodes. And they're fantastic. And there are so many other fringe indie groups that are coming up that are really doing the sort of activisty publishing, but also bringing and like recentering folks that have been relegated to margins for too long. And it's really beautiful to see, to witness, and to be a part of in small ways. So, yeah, thank you for bringing in that hope and also that reminder that, okay, there's a lot more to do. Before we close, I want to like maybe get a little personal and get a little more understanding of how you write and how you think. Um, Recently, you pursued a PhD in English Studies and Creative Writing in Durham, and it was so interesting and inspiring because it's decades of you're a writer. What made you want to return to a formal like space to study, and what were some questions you took with you there? What was the experience like? Yeah, it was fascinating for me to learn that you did that.
So I always had this feeling, and that I sort of still needed to study a little more. I had applied at various point. I applied in my 20s, and then I applied when I was around 30. And I did get admission, but I didn't have scholarships. And so I let it go basically. I didn't fight hard enough at the time. But I think what has started to happen was that in the last few years, even before the PhD, I was writing, but I was also teaching alongside. And the more I taught, the more I realized that, okay, I still have some growing up to do also. In perhaps growing up is not the right phrase, a certain kind of intellectual growth I was looking for. And I felt that I can keep writing and learning that way. And I think that is actually the best way, just doing it yourself. But I had never had the time or the luxury to actually sit down and research without intervening, competing things going on, distractions, and just the need to make a living. So, what happens is that as journalists, when we write, or as a freelancer, when I was writing, I'm writing my novel, but I'm also writing 5 columns alongside, or, I'm trying to research something else. So, the maximum amount of time I've ever got to research anything at all has been 5 days. When I did Unbound, I spent 3.5 years on it. But I did 3.5 years just reading for the book, but also then doing 50 other things at the same time. And so, even as I was doing that book, I still didn't have enough time to, for example, read theories of gender that would help inform and shape my own writing. And I needed that time. So when COVID happened, I had a job. I was teaching, but I was teaching online. And then there was a little more time to think and think about what do I next? What do I do next? Where do I go from here? How do I want to grow? Not just what I can contribute to other people's education, but how do I need to grow? So I felt that if I don't do a PhD now, it was unlikely I'll ever do it. So I said, okay, give it one last, like really just do the applications. Because also during COVID, for the first time, because we weren't all running about commuting, all of that, I actually had the time to sit back and put together an application. So I did it partly for those reasons. Um, I think also that when you start teaching, you also understand that education comes within certain structures, right? So, for example, if you're teaching a short workshop, I can decide the structure. But if I am teaching in a college or in a university, the degree itself has a certain structure. You teach one module or two modules, or you teach throughout the year. But the students then need to plug themselves into the system in certain ways. They have to think about, okay, now I've done a BA, now I will do an MA, then I will do a PhD. And I thought that it would be good for me personally to understand how these structures work. So now, having done it, I can say I do understand them. What you do with that knowledge is a separate thing. But at least now I have learned. That is something. And this is the first time I've spent 4 years on a single topic, just in-depth reading and kind of diverse readings and how they shape your thinking. So I think that I have learned and benefited from that. And I'm very glad I got the opportunity to do so.
I must say, I feel like through the screen, I can share the joy that you're feeling to have had the 3 to 4 years to read and to think. And it is such a privilege. And I feel like one that's not afforded to women as much, right? The time, expensiveness, the space to be, to think, to deep dive. Because I felt very similar things. Of course, not, I mean, I'm not a writer, so not in the same way, but just that feeling of always being rushed and within the system to get that pause is beautiful. I will say your students are really lucky to have a teacher who wants to experience the difficulties and the joys of a system to be able to share that ahead, to be able to guide ahead very well. No, that's really lovely. Thank you. So I have two quick questions for you before we close. One is especially for writers who are listening in, who themselves might come from marginalized communities. It's really difficult to deal with the gatekeeping. Your story isn't universal, it's too niche. I remember reading this thing where someone who was a Kenyan scholar said they wanted to research Britishers, like they wanted to research a specific British community. And they were told it doesn't make sense, you should research your own country, right? So, even some of these tensions and questions, what advice would you give them? Like practical advice, or even sometimes just political encouragement? What would you offer?
I mean, I think that there are two aspects here. One is that, yes, sometimes people do say your topic is too niche, etc. On the other hand, a really niche topic can also be a truly interesting one because no one else has done it. So, what happens is that with, say, a research degree with an MA or a PhD, or even any other kind of proposal, the main problem is funding, right? Otherwise, you can sit at home and you can do your own research if you're really that keen on it. But funding is a big part of the problem. The other is the institutional affiliation. Sometimes you need that. You have to cast a wide net. I mean, I chose my topic, but I had a list of 2 or 3 topics. It wasn't that I had just one. And you have to decide who you want to work with. First, you approach the institution. It's not that everyone says yes immediately. It's not that everyone is equally excited. All I would say is, firstly, don't give up. If you're really interested in something, then there is somebody else out there who will back it. But it might take longer to get there. It might, uh, I mean, for me, it took, say, 5 applications. But before that, if you look at it from a longer point of view, I have at various times applied for various things and the rejections never stop coming. They don't stop coming even now. You apply and apply and apply and apply and you get rejected over and over and over and over. So many people, even when you're writing about really important and mainstream things. I remember I wrote an essay, a kind of part book review, part essay about Nazism and the Nazi atrocities. And I was getting no interest at all, even in the Western world. In India, I finally managed to publish the essay. What does happen then? It's not just gatekeeping because it's not that the topic is not of interest to them. It's that they don't want you writing about it, right? They want to be able to decide who wants to write about what and what is of interest. They're interested, say, in fascism when it comes to their doorstep. They're not interested about some third world person reflecting about the growth of fascism and how these things are all interconnected. They don't want to hear that necessarily. Um, I mean, that's my understanding of it. It could just be they didn't like my writing, which is also fine. I'll accept that too. But I think what happens with ideas is that you have to find your people. And that can mean people who will back you. That can mean people who are interested in having a certain kind of diverse academic or literary environment in which they are working. It will take longer, but you have to find those spaces. And it, it doesn't help to simply sit back and say that, oh, but nobody's letting me. Nobody has ever let anyone do anything, especially where power is concerned. Nobody let women have the vote. We fought for it. So yeah, you have to. If nobody else is willing to do it, you have to do it. People have to find people like yourself, set up your own collective, and start publishing.
I love that. For the longest time, like power is just not something people are going to give up. And it has to be something you take back, and to be able to apply that to even writing and publishing is important. Just sometime back you said how publishing in literature is so important to a nation and its growth, and ensuring that it remains rooted in its original spirit. And that really is right, because that influences narrative, it influences how we think, it gives us the boundaries of our thinking, sometimes what is possible and available. um, Even if I think of like content, even if I think of Instagram posts or LinkedIn posts, they shape the boundary of what feels possible in my mind. So yeah, a little bit of encouragement of bravery and taking action, and not letting people, or not waiting for people to do something for you. Removing that element of permission seems really important. So my last question, we asked this to everybody. Who are you reading? What have you read that you think our listeners must necessarily read? Like, if you can give us your top five.
Uh, okay. So what I'm reading, I won't say too much because most of my reading over the last 4 years has been research related. Um, However, there's one book that I think everybody should read, man, woman, Western Indian, whoever you are, you must read Nivedita Menon's Seeing Like a Feminist. It is a book that did shape my thinking. And it's not that the ideas are not out there already. Sometimes it affirms your ideas, but sometimes it also challenges and stretches your ideas. What does it mean to be a feminist? What does it mean to look at women not necessarily as a woman, but as a feminist, which you have to make that distinction and allow for various conversations to happen. So this was one of the transformative books for me. Um, I would also say I read this very good book recently, which I found quite interesting. It's a novel by Neelam Saran Gaur. It's a book on Janki Bai Ilhabadi. It's called Requiem in Rag Janaki. It's a good book. I enjoyed it. So if you're interested in music particularly, it's a good book. Give me one sec. I read this very interesting book by Isabella Hamad called Enter Ghost. It kind of brings together my interest in both politics. It's set in Palestine, but it's also about theater and performing arts. And so it's about somebody trying to perform Hamlet in Palestine, and really well written. I liked the book. Um, I think Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's The Annihilation of Caste, always and eternally. Please read it. I think for India particularly, I really don't see why it's not prescribed on the syllabus of every school. It is. I am ashamed to say that nobody thought to do it when I was a child. I would have gained so much from it if it was taught to me in high school. And I think uh, even outside, people recommended I read Gandhi, people recommended I read Nehru, but for the longest time, nobody recommended that I read Ambedkar. And I think that it is absolutely urgent that we do that, read that. Um, and I would say, just because this is one of my all-time favorite books structurally, um, it's Doris Lessing's The Golden Notebook. big fat book. I love books with interesting structure. Structure always gets me, even if there's the story itself kind of comes and goes, but um, uh, how she manages to hold this book within a book structure and how she manages, and it's also there's a lot of it there that it's very revealing about the writer it's herself, not Doris the writer, but writing in general and the woman as writer. And it's about um, how bits and parts of your life will always get into the text, but it both is and isn't the text. The boundaries kind of blur. Often when women write something, you assume that, oh, this must have happened to her. Or maybe it did, but maybe also it didn't. Or maybe it didn't happen in this way. Maybe she didn't tell the whole story, etc., etc. So I find that book very interesting from that perspective. That's fine.
Thank you. I love the range we have. I'm sure that everyone listening in, but we also share this on our Instagram, is going to really enjoy getting to know these books a little closely. Thank you so much, Annie, for the conversation and also just all the hard questions of representation. We've really enjoyed speaking with you. Like I told you when I came into this conversation, we have team members, we have community members who are just so excited we're speaking to you. You have a massive fan following inside the book club. Your books have really inspired, I would say, a generation to think about politics and identity with more nuance, with more space for tension, and with more space, I think, for being wrong about our assumptions and allowing ourselves time to think, to listen, and really get to know the other before making assumptions. So, yeah, thank you for giving us time today. So, for listeners, Annie's books, Prelude to a Riot, Breath, Cement, Cactus, Known Turf, and Unbound, are all available to purchase. We'll put links into our show notes, and we strongly recommend you get yourself a copy. Today, this has been the Sanskaari Girls Podcast. I'm Vandita Morarka. Please follow us on Instagram, sign up for our membership, it's free, and also subscribe to our newsletter. A big shout out to Anjali on production and scripting, and Kuhu on overall coordination and support. Please keep reading, writing, and finding new ways to make your voice heard through the written word.